Hello, I'm Ian Grayling. I'm the Executive Director of the East Midlands Centre for Excellence in Teacher Training. And in this particular presentation, I would like to share with you the emCETT approach to embedding English, maths, technology within the vocational curriculum. Now, this approach has evolved for us over 6, 7 years, possibly longer. And in many ways, I would have to say that there's nothing particularly radical about this approach, but I do believe there are subtle emphases within our approach which are not often communicated or explained within or through other sort of avenues of professional development to support this area of the curriculum. Okay, for us, and in our experience working with the sector, effective embedding starts with a clear ethos and belief. An ethos and belief which is voiced vociferously. It is shared by everybody within the provider institution, and when I say everybody, that means all levels within the organisation, but of course the learners as well. In other words, there is a clear understanding that maths, English, technological fluency or literacy, these skills are not an add-on. They're not icing on the cake. They are integral to economic and social well-being, even more so with the economic climate as it has been developing in recent years. So where that ethos and belief is firmly held and firmly shared by all concerned, embedding is a much easier task. Where that ethos and belief is not really explicitly shared and so not communicated strongly from the top, then embedding in our experience tends to be rather hit or miss. And it needs to be said that this ethos is not just a matter of a mission statement. Sadly, too often provider institutions have mission statements which are at best a statement aimed at marketing. They're not, it doesn't necessarily reflect a strongly held belief within the organisation itself. So as far as we're concerned, effective embedding must start with that strong shared ethos. Well, if ethos is the starting point for effective embedding, it should also be quite clear that this must come from senior managers. It has to be first and foremost the responsibility of senior managers to communicate this ethos, to explore this belief with all concerned, with all stakeholders, all staff at all levels, and of course learners. It should, for example, feature within the professional development review or appraisal process. Learners need to know about this ethos, this belief, this commitment to these skills within, at the outset of their programme. It should be made absolutely clear within a learning contract, etc. Now, it's not enough simply to communicate the message either. Senior managers must also ensure that whether this is directly themselves or through cascading through the management structure, that there needs to be clarity about what effective embedding actually means. It's not sufficient simply to say to teachers, go forth and embed. They really do need to understand what that means in practice. And I have to say that as we travel around various institutions in the wider FE sector, we still find a lot of uncertainty about what embedding means in practice. Now, for teachers, it does inevitably mean that they need some sort of toolkit, and here's 4 or 5 examples of the sort of things that can help them embedding, and they need that support. But also, they need to be clear about what their role is in this, in the sense of, are they being asked to teach English, maths, technology, as well as their vocational specialism, or is it something more subtle? I actually think it's something more subtle. We should be telling our teachers that if you feel able to, coach learners. By all means, coach them in the use of their English, in their use of valid, accurate maths, in the use of technology. But if they don't feel that they can coach them, then refer them to an expert within the institution or to resources. And there are actually an amazing collection of resources, e-resources particularly, available to learners in the FE system at this point in time. So it should be possible to refer them on to support. Secondly, it's important that we encourage self and peer assessment, and the teachers encourage that, because the reality is that although all institutions have to have some process to support an ILP, again, in our experience, ILPs are often done poorly, and they lose the respect of the staff and the pupil, the learner, not necessarily because the ILP process is wrong or is bad. It's more a case that teachers do not have the time. They do not have the time to spend in formatively assessing on an individual basis against targets for literacy, numeracy, language and technology, as well as the vocational specialism. So we need teachers to understand that they should be encouraging self and peer assessment, and we'll look at that again a bit later on. And finally, of course, they need to be aware that if they are identifying any concerns about these skills, then they need to let somebody know about it and refer it on at the earliest possible opportunity. It's not okay, for example, to find out 12 weeks into a program when the first BTEC assignment is submitted that there is a significant literacy issue. 12 weeks is too late. We need to know about this at the earliest possible point. And teachers need to be clear about what their role is there. Not that we're asking them to teach these subjects, but coach if they can, encourage self and peer assessment, and refer on at the earliest possible time. If we then turn our attention to learners, learners need, as part of their contract of learning, to understand that the responsibility for the development of maths, English and technology, and for that matter, their vocational subject, lies with them. It is their responsibility. We need to encourage that learner autonomy. We need to encourage that sense of responsibility. But it isn't abnegating responsibility, because they need to also understand that the institution is there to help them through its staff, through its resources. Okay, let's return to teachers and trainers. It's our belief that teachers and trainers need to be absolutely crystal clear that what we're asking them to do is not so much teach the subject, but to, by the subject I mean English, maths and technology. We're not asking them to teach it so much as to provide frequent opportunities for the learners to practice those skills and to gain feedback, because as we know, we all know that in order for learners to learn, for any of us to learn and make good progress in learning, we need frequent practice, and along with frequent practice, we need to be able to receive feedback on how well we're doing. And of course, the converse of that is true as well, that if practice is limited, um, uh, then also that limits the opportunities to give formative feedback, and progress is going to be slow, certainly impaired. Now, for the teacher then, this really means enabling learning rather than teaching in the first place. And for the learners, they need to be actively engaged in that process. So here we're talking about a pedagogy which isn't didactic, it isn't led from the front. It's a pedagogy which is based in active, challenge-based, problem-centered or problem-based learning, where the learners have to sort of figure it out for themselves. And for lots of reasons, we also believe strongly in that learning being collaborative as well. I mean, at least or an immediate thing that will come out of collaborative learning is both informal and formal opportunities for speech, spoken language, and more. So, for the learners, little and often, lots of practice, lots of feedback. In most vocational areas, even in sort of workshop situations, learners have to produce job sheets. They're quite often involved in measuring, and so on and so on. And actually, you only need 2 or 3 sentences to be written to be able to diagnose whether there is a literacy issue there, or if in fact, having diagnosed it earlier, whether there are signs that the learner's progressed at all. So for the teacher again, they tend to then ask to think about, well, what do we do in terms of learning support? Whose role is it? Or how do we supply the learning support? Well, I think the answer to that is that as mentioned earlier, there are an awful lot of resources out there which will support active self-paced learning, often e-resources. And hopefully within your institution, there's also the expert as well. So let's look again at learners. Learners need, as I said earlier, to be very clear from the outset of their program that English, maths and technological skills matter. They need to understand why they matter. They need to understand why they are so important and need to be an integral part of their vocational learning. Now, if they have that understanding, if that understanding is quite clear, then it then becomes more possible to engage the learners in setting their own targets. And I should say at this point that we really do emphasize the need for learners to be learning actively, to be doing projects, big or small, solving problems within the vocational subject, the vocational context. The starting point is always a vocational context. It's always real work, real life. And then out of that, numeracy, literacy, technology falls out. And on occasions when it doesn't naturally fall out, it is more than feasible 9 times out of 10 to enrich that opportunity so it does. So for example, if there's no technology in there, get learners to produce some sort of output, take out their mobile phones, photograph it, upload it into a Word document or a PowerPoint display, embed some text around it, present it, etc., etc. There are always ways of enriching a vocational activity so that it provides lots of opportunities for achieving literacy, maths and technological outcomes. Now, if we take that as a starting point, then before starting a particular project, learners should be encouraged to reflect on what maths, what English literacy, what technological skills are going to be naturally occurring within that, or, as I said earlier, they might enrich that activity to include. Now, if they do that, it should be quite feasible for them to also self-assess prior to that project, that task, that challenge, and to determine where they currently are at with regard to that particular skill or an aspect of that skill. We should then enable them after the activity, the project, the challenge, the problem. After that part of the session or the program has been completed, to encourage them to self-evaluate again to see what in fact they've achieved as a result of the activity. And there is a place there for peer assessment as well. And essentially what this is about is actually not being afraid to let your learners have the criteria against which they're being assessed. These could be the formal assessment criteria, as in functional skills criteria. They could be the vocational criteria. They could be personal targets that an individual sets. For example, an individual may not be very confident talking, even informally, within a group. Well, there is a personal target there that they should be encouraged to set and to continually self-evaluate against. Now, it's also possible for them to record that as well as on paper, but they could record it in the form of a spidergram. Those of you who are not familiar with that and other methods of doing this might want to look at our other presentation in this area, which looks more closely at challenge-based learning and self-assessment and collaborative learning in support of embedding. So within that presentation, there'll be some specific ideas on how to do this. But if your learners are then actively engaged in project or challenge-based learning, it then frees you up, the teacher, to float around, to facilitate, to guide, to ensure that your learners are on track, they're not going astray. And it also gives you time to sit down with individuals and look at their targets and discuss them, and if necessary, refer them on to some resource, whether that's a person or an e-resource, which might help them between then and the next activity. Now, if learners are doing this, if they're setting their own targets, if they're self-evaluating, they're peer assessing, they're self-assessing, they are in effect maintaining their own ILP. And that ILP will be an ILP which has meaning for them, as opposed to a teacher-led ILP process, which just feels to be administrative or even bureaucratic, and therefore quite distant and lacking in relevance. So we do strongly advocate that learners take responsibility for their learning in functional skills, in English, maths, technology, and they are actively engaged in target setting, self-assessing, peer assessing, and maintaining their own ILP. And if they are empowered in that way, they will also be encouraged to raise their hand and say, look, I'm struggling with this, can you help? And that, of course, is where the teacher decides, as we said earlier, whether they feel able to coach or whether they feel that is the time to refer on to an expert or to other resources. So that's it for the emCETT approach to embedding. I hope you found that useful. You may want to have a look at our other resource on embedding, which focuses much more on practical tools, particularly those which use challenge-based learning, collaborative learning, and self and peer assessment in order to support embedding. So please have a look at that, and please contact us with any feedback or any issues arising. Thank you.